What do you get when you mix a little bit of creativity and CPU horsepower with a desire to take a chunk out of the growing retro gaming market? You get the GKD 350. Vying to make every other new and unreleased product in this price range obsolete before they can even be placed in their packaging, the developers behind the GKD 350 hope to make a bold statement with their debut entry-level device. Hello everyone, my name is Taki, and today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the mysterious Game Kiddy 350. The GKD 350 features a custom 1.5 GHz MIPS processor, 128 megabytes of RAM, 16 gigabytes of internal storage, a 2300 mAh battery, a 3.5-inch 320 by 240 IPS display, a small D-pad with an analog joystick on the left side, ABXY buttons on the right side with start and select, a 1-watt mono speaker near the front palm rest, a single set of L&R shoulder buttons on the top of the device, a micro USB port for charging and data transfer, a stereo headphone jack, and an external SD card slot with support for an additional 250 gigabytes of storage. The unit itself weighs in at 155 grams with a length of 150 millimeters by 75 including the shoulder buttons and a width of 20 millimeters including the joysticks. Looking specifically at the front of the device, we find our 3.5-inch display, which is popular in all of the current generation of devices coming out of China this quarter. Unlike its competitors, this device is not protected by an external sheet of glass and will come with only a glass screen protector out of the box. I've gone ahead and removed mine in order to add a third-party protector later on, but the one that's given to you should provide you some protection from minor nicks and scratches. This panel is not going to be able to take a beating like the other devices in this generation, so you will probably want to purchase a unit with a carrying case to protect your investment. It's hard to describe this display, but the IPS panel that's used in this device is certainly as sharp as the competition, but the brightness of this screen is really where this device shines, as it offers a much higher maximum brightness setting than any other retro device on the market. Moving on to ergonomics, which in my opinion is a large selling point for this device. I received this unit a few days ago, and it's been my daily driver for over 20 hours worth of testing at this point, and it's slowly becoming my preferred form factor in a retro handheld. The D-pad and 4 input buttons are located in the upper half of the 350, allowing your hands to mold around the curves of this device. The design should rest nicely in the palm of your hand and provide some much needed comfort for longer gaming sessions. The D-pad is responsive with a small amount of pressure required to make contact, and the directional arrows themselves have a smooth finish that feels comfortable on the thumb after long hours of play. The joystick is a low-profile analog component with a smooth top that moves easily in all directions. The stick snaps back into place after use quickly, and it also has the ability to spin. I find myself using this as a fidget device while I'm waiting for loading screens in some PS1 titles. The stick is by no means a bad component, but I would have preferred to have a stick with a little bit more grip on it, as this one can easily get slippery at times. On the right side of the device, we see our ABXY buttons, which have a rounded, smooth top to them. These 4 buttons are probably my favorite in terms of comfort over long gaming sessions. The buttons produce a small amount of audible noise when pressed, but they are extremely responsive. These start and select buttons are probably the most rigid buttons on this device, so you won't need to worry about accidentally activating them during play. On the top of the device, we have our final 2 buttons, which unfortunately are a single L&R button. These are probably the weakest physical part of this device. The switches sit atop a mini contact switch, which is placed pretty far from the switches themselves. This means that the shoulder buttons are almost flush with the device before they start to make contact with the translucent switch under the case. While these buttons are by no means bad, I prefer the way the switches work in the RS97, where the entire switch is able to be depressed instead of just the side opposite to the hinge. I want to briefly talk about the build quality and casing for this device. Color scheme aside, I find the implementation of this translucent case to be one of the best in this range. Usually when we see cases like this, you think, oh man, that looks sick, and you go out and buy it, and then you realize that the reviewer failed to mention that there's an LED light with the power of 7 suns that will blind anybody in the vicinity on the underside of the device. At least that was my experience with the first LDK that I bought before I switched it with a yellow one. This translucent case reminds me a little bit of the various N64 colors that came out during that product's life cycle, and I'm happy to see that the LED lights on this unit are not overpowering on the front panel. I don't personally know that a considerable amount of time went into the thought process behind the materials that were used for this plastic mold, but I will say unequivocally that this is the best feeling case out of anything on the market right now. It's smooth, but not slippery, and it doesn't feel cheap, even though it's made out of plastic. The closest device that I have that reminds me of this feeling would have to be the RS97. In the future, I'd love to have the option of being able to purchase some back grips for this device, but for now, this is a great start. And finally, I want to take a brief moment to talk about the mono speaker on this unit, as I think it's one of the biggest letdowns with a device this good. In a generation of consoles that all have stereo speakers with decent quality, this unit seems to be straight from another era. The speaker component that was used on this board feels cheap in comparison to the rest of the unit. I know that I shouldn't expect much, but the speaker itself is very tinny. I almost always want to pick up a set of headphones and use those instead of listening to the onboard sound, but maybe that's just me. The following is a mic'd up recording of the speaker. Sound issues aside, it's worth mentioning that if you're a person with big hands, you will probably end up covering a portion of this speaker with your hand during play. It hasn't affected me, but I can see that this is a potential issue for some gamers. Not a whole lot is known about what goes on under the hood of this device at this moment, but the device does seem to be running a custom build of OpenDingX ported to the system by an internal developer. This is in stark contrast to some of the other devices that are released from Chinese companies that are either ported through community efforts or through contracted work of prominent developers in the open source scene. The build date of the software in my unit is relatively new, with a build date listed of September 26th. In terms of emulators, we have all of your favorites. Essentially, all of the systems that are supported by other devices like this one are preloaded on this device. There's also a collection of open source games with this unit, and these are going to be the same things that you see in other devices, except that you can expect higher performance when you're playing them on the 350. I've already covered PS1 performance in another video, so I won't bother showcasing too much of it on this one. If you're interested in looking at that PS1 performance, you can click the card in the top right hand corner of your screen now to go to that video. Essentially, the processor in this device is powerful enough to play any PS1 title without frame skip. There are a few games that you'll need to disable HEL BIOS to be able to play, like CTR and Diablo, but this thing can generally handle almost anything. I say almost because this unit doesn't include L and R2 buttons, and those are required for a decent amount of PS1 games, so you're going to need to resort to some remapping if you want to play those titles on this device. I do want to mention, because a lot of people asked in my 350 review, the internal SD card in my unit came preloaded with a ton of ROMs for each system, along with some cover art for each game. The only downside of this is the fact that these titles are in Chinese, but the majority of the ROMs themselves are in English. For the purposes of this section of the video, I'm going to pop in my testing SD card in the external slot and go. First, let's tackle some more demanding SNES titles. The added 500 MHz should make it possible to run everything in the SNES library without frame skip, and for the most part that is the case, but we do have some other issues. There are two SNES emulators on this machine, and so far I've been able to find one difference between the two of them. The first being the crazy screen shake that happens when you play Yoshi's Island. On one of the emulators, both the top and the bottom screens vibrate, which is a big deal breaker. Putting that aside, the system seems to be causing some visual stuttering by emulating the game too fast. This is visible in almost any level I've played on this game. It's less visible in things like Star Fox, which runs perfectly on this device without the added shake on the top and the bottom, but it is visible in less demanding titles like Mario Kart. This shows me that much more work needs to be done to improve SNES performance on this device, because it's a joke for hardware this powerful to have any issues at all. Moving on to other systems, there are no visible stutters from Genesis emulation that I could see based on my testing. Sega CD also works without any issues, but 32X is still unplayable due to an emulator issue. There aren't any noticeable issues in GBA or PC Engine from any of the titles that I've tested, which is to be expected given how these perform on lower processors. Beyond PS1 performance, where this device can really shine is solely in its ability to play arcade titles. This could be a video all in itself, so I'm going to only focus on a small amount of CPS titles for this portion of the review. Be forewarned, I'm terrible at arcade games, but this device isn't. I want to quickly just talk about battery life for a second. The manufacturer mentions that this device should get 6 hours of battery life. The most that I've ever been able to get with max brightness playing PS1 titles was 4.5 hours. In this final section of the review, I want to basically summarize my thoughts on this device. The GKD 350 is without a doubt the most comfortable retro handheld system that I own. It has a top-of-the-line IPS panel and one of the most powerful processors out of anything in this market. In a market where manufacturers typically go through 2 iterations of a device before they get something that's usable, the GKD 350 is a breath of fresh air right out the gate. Its slim form factor signifies that it's going to be a run-and-gun emulation machine, and anyone would be glad to have this device in their collection. With a few exceptions, the GKD 350 can emulate anything that you throw at it, but it's not without its faults. First and foremost is software. As it currently stands, the manufacturer is the only one with the ability to make improvements to this device, as they haven't given over the keys to the kingdom yet. This is a potential concern, as devices like this live and die by the developers that choose to invest time in them, and the manufacturers decided at this point to keep aspects of this device under lock and key. If the manufacturer ends up releasing updates to this unit through in-house development, that will be one of the first times that something like this has happened in this market. Going forward, there are a lot of things that need to be refined. SNES emulation needs to be improved to fix the stuttering issues, and key mapping needs to be implemented to compensate for lack of PS1 buttons. Hardware limitations will probably mean that this device is limited in what it can do post-launch, so it's really important that the launch emulation support is as strong as possible. Future iterations of this device should include more RAM and a GPU to open up the next generation of emulators for these retro handhelds. The GKD 350 is vying to be the best emulation machine in this generation, and that very well may be the case at this point, but software updates and better hardware utilization may mean that the lower performance devices like the RG350 and the on-release Pocket Go 2 will pass it in terms of supported systems. Even if those devices do end up supporting better systems like N64 and PSP in the future, the GKD 350 is still a great choice depending on the price point that this thing sells at. As of right now, this device is currently not for sale outside of China, but I will include a link in the description box below the moment that this thing is available for sale. It currently retails in China for around $50, which is an easy recommend all around, even with the faults that I've pointed out. If you see this in the future for less than $80, pick it up and you won't want to put it down. My name is Taki, and I've been your host on this review. If you like what you saw here, consider supporting the channel by subscribing for future videos. Now get out and go enjoy the rest of your day. Taki out.